Hello everyone, this is Conrad Zutenhorst. I see we have people chiming in, so we'll go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Welcome to the Somewhere Over the Rainbow webinars on sexual orientation and gender identity in international education. Somewhere Over the Rainbow is a program of the University of Maryland College Park, and this webinar series is co-presented with the Consortium of Higher Education LGBTQ Resource Professionals. Thanks to our planning committee made up of Bill Sherma, Eric Izagirre, Katrina Knudsen, Nicholas Sakurai, Demira Woolway, and Conrad Zutenhorst. This is part of a series of 4 free professional developed webinars designed for international education administrators who are interested in learning more about these topics. The webinars are every Thursday of April at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and more information about this and other webinars is available on the Somewhere Over the Rainbow website. A link to this session will be posted online in the next few days while following the session. You can also go to the website to sign up for our email list so you can learn more about our programs, such as the in-person conference we are planning for April 2017 in the Washington, D.C. area. We will also post the website link in the chat box now. Today's session is entitled Floating Cities in the Sky, Applying Queer Theory in the Field of International Education, and is presented by Dr. Roger Adkins of Gustavus Adolphus College. Dr. Adkins holds an MA in Gender Studies and both an MA and a PhD in Comparative Literature, and much of Dr. Adkins' academic training and ongoing research draws upon or utilizes queer studies and queer theory. Dr. Adkins has also worked in the field of international education for the past 15 years, much of that time in education abroad specifically. Dr. Adkins is currently the director of the International Center and the SIO for a small liberal arts college in the Swedish Lutheran tradition. As a queer-identified and genderqueer professional, Dr. Adkins is very interested in thinking about the possible intersections of queer identities and scholarships with intercultural theory and education. Dr. Adkins, I'm going to turn this over to you. Thank you everyone for your time and attention, and please enjoy this webinar.
Okay, I think I've got myself unmuted here. Hello everyone, good morning or good afternoon or good noon, wherever you might be. So yeah, this is Floating Cities in the Sky, and I wanted to say this was in the webinar description, but this main title comes from a novel by Jeannette Winterson called Sexing the Cherry, at the very end of which she describes, this is a very esoteric and kind of metafictional novel, and at the very end she describes a feeling of sort of floating away on a city that's hovering in the clouds above the earth, and in which you might look down on the countries below and notice that the borders are vanishing and disappearing, and it's all just becoming kind of a muddled reality of the people of the earth and all of their complexity. And I think that's very much in the spirit of what queer theory tries to do, looking at breaking down different kinds of categorizations and boundaries and taking them apart, unpacking them, thinking about how they're political in various ways, who might benefit from them, and who might be the folks facing oppression because of different kinds of categorizations. So that's really why I like to apply and use queer theory, even in our work in intercultural education, which may not be a ready assumption or something that a lot of folks would think of as the most obvious place to apply queer theory. Queer theory presents some very unique perspectives on how identity works. It tends to be relatively heady theory, a very cerebral branch of theory, and for that reason I'm going to do my best to look at a couple of concepts and kind of bring them down to earth and think about ways in which they can be quite practical in our work. So just to kind of give a lay of the land, some key concepts from queer theory. On the left-hand side are some of the kind of operating principles that you'll find more or less universally assumed among most people who work in the field of queer studies or queer theory. And that is things like difference is political, always. Anytime we have a sense of social difference, we tend to, almost in the same moment of perceiving the difference, make a judgment about that difference and hierarchicalize the 2 or 3 or more different sides of that difference. But also binaries and categories are not reliable. We know this in terms of gender pretty readily today. There is enough treatment of this in our media and our pop culture and in our own learning and training that For example, there are lots of folks for whom the binary of female and male identity as the two options for gender identity simply don't work, either because they experience it differently, they have experiences that they would feel are perhaps coming from both gender identities or from outside of either gender identity. Also because there are folks who, for example, might be intersex, who are born with, even in their bodies, and whether it's in their genotype, in their hormonal composition, or in the presentation of their genital structure, their sexual and reproductive anatomy, that they're not fitting the binaries as we understand them. And categories in general, even beyond the ones that are binaristic, also quite questionable as far as queer theory is concerned. So there is, for example, queer theory of race and ethnicity that looks at the troubled nature of categories that we use to describe race and ethnicity. Another assumption of queer theory, things are a lot more complicated and intricate than we like to think. Even after we start to accept some of the other points in this list, there's always another layer down into the complexity of people's experiences. Any time we create a labeling system, even if we think it's a relatively well-informed one, we're already obfuscating some of the complexity and oversimplifying for the purpose of maybe making it easier to understand. But queer theory challenges us to be a little more critical in that way. Identity is also dynamic as far as queer theory is concerned, never fixed or fixable. It's always changing. It's always in a state of becoming. I mean, every moment your identity is slowly progressing in various kinds of directions, and not really even in just one direction. It's not a linear progression. It's very situational in that way. And the specific context or situation matters too. A lot of us, for example, could pretty easily identify that we have one kind of gender or sexual identity when we're with our colleagues, and maybe a slightly different one when we're with our partner or with our family at home. And that may change again if we're in the context of our religious community or some other kind of non-professional community to which we belong. So those are just kind of some of the operating principles that we find in queer theory. Three concepts I want to kind of zoom in on today and discuss in some more detail are on the right-hand side here. Performativity, queering, which is the verb here, as in to queer something, and disidentification, which is a mouthful in more ways than one, and which I'll talk about in a little bit here. So first, starting with performativity. The graphic you see here, of course, is looking out from backstage at a theater house, and the notion of performativity builds off of the metaphor of the theatrical in ways that are really useful, but can also become a limiting factor for this concept if we take the metaphor too far. But just to kind of begin with the metaphor, the idea that identity is performed is an idea that we have to be conscious about in some cases, and even when not conscious, subconsciously monitoring all the aspects of our performance of our identity. So things such as how we speak, what we might say or not say, our costuming, quote unquote, or whether or not we wear makeup and how we wear it, how we present ourselves in terms of comportment, in terms of how our body moves through space and interacts with other bodies, how much space it takes up. This list goes on and on and on. You can easily begin to imagine when you use this metaphor that there are lots of things you can look to as performance of identity. Important thing to note too is that to say that identity is performative is not really to be saying that it's not real, that it's fake somehow. And this is a place that criticism of post-structural, postmodern theory in general, not even just queer theory, runs to pretty quickly. That, oh, so it's constructed or it's performative, that means it's not real. You're saying people's experiences of their identity aren't real. That's not at all what people espousing these theories are saying. What they're saying actually is that they're not real, this is the next bullet, in the ways that we let ourselves think that they are. In other words, a lot of our assumptions about identity have to do with identity being natural or being normal in some way. And those two terms are really, of course, quite loaded in ways those of us paying attention to LGBTQ plus identities are well aware of. And so folks who want to look at identity as performative don't say that people don't really experience their identities. They're just saying the way that we experience them is through this constant ongoing negotiation, which is contextual and which only makes sense in the broader context of our culture, because just like the theater, there's a certain array of things that are possible. There are some limits to the possible when it comes to performing identity. There's only a certain number of cues that can be read at any one point in a culture and function in the way that you would like them to. So there are ways in which you could perform your gender identity that are wildly out of sorts with the current culture, and there can be consequences for that. And sometimes those can be quite dire consequences, but more commonly, they're undesirable social consequences, even if they don't result in violence or imprisonment or other things like that that we would see as the more dramatic responses. So, thinking about gender as performed, first look at this graphic for a moment, this costume, if you will, and we'll have the first poll here in a second once you've had a moment to think about what you're seeing. Okay, let's see if I actually know how to do this. Hopefully this poll is now visible, and I'm going to open it for you and you can begin to answer. Okay, I think we more or less got most of our answers here. Of course, this one's a little bit tongue-in-cheek and in some ways runs against the very theories I'm talking about today, but this was meant to kind of get us started and perhaps be a little bit of a funnier take on the issues. Now let's see if I can figure out how to get rid of the poll. Okay, so when it comes to gender and performance, it's not all about the culture, but we do tend to kind of fall into the pattern of talking about things, particularly in our field, our intercultural field, in terms of culture, and that becomes a little bit of a monolithic concept sometimes. So when we talk about, what women and men do in Japan, for example, which is where this costume happens to be from, we maybe over rely on the idea of what it means to be Japan, what it means to be from Japan, what it means to be Japanese. And that's something that we might want to be a little more critical about. If we can think of gender as performative, even within a culture, the vast diversity of ways that people perform their genders, anywhere from with a slight variation from one to the next to something dramatically different, even within the confines of that culture, that can become a very useful tool. When we're conducting, for example, intercultural orientations, whether those are for incoming international students or outgoing study away students, we can talk about this idea of gender as performative and give the students the tools to work with so that they can be good ethnographic observers and think about how are people performing their gender in this everyday situations that I'm observing, and what does that mean, and how are their variations on the performance that also carry meaning in this cultural context. And over time, as they accumulate sort of a catalog of experiences and ideas, they can begin to understand the complexity of gender and not rely on, for example, a simple idea: Japanese women are X and Japanese men are Y. It can also help remove some of the judgment when we're explaining differing practices that may be quite loaded culturally in different ways. One ready example here is if we're talking to a group of US students heading out into a culture in which the people whom we would identify as women typically wear head covering of some sort whenever they're in public on an everyday basis. And there might be some very quick judgment that rushes to people's minds when they think about that particular performance of gender. If we can talk about it as performance, we can pull back a little bit from the ready judgment and let people think about, okay, so this is how people whom we would identify as women communicate something about their identity in this culture. Then we open up a critical space in which we can also think about how people might actually experience that, and the fact that there's a kind of agency in it too, that it isn't just that this is forced upon each individual. There are people making a decision every day to put this garment on and to wear it, and perhaps there are ways in which they see advantages as well, which is something that sometimes women who study away in cultures in which other women wear head coverings come back and talk about in the US. There could be a real importance here too for LGBTQ plus students, because if we can think about sexual identity as something that's performed from culture to culture, then we can help remove, again, some of the more judgmental notions, or the idea, for example, of going back into the closet when visiting a particular culture or in a particular context. Remembering, for example, that performance is situational and moment to moment, that's a lot less final and final a concept as going into the closet, which sounds like a kind of closing off that really might separate students from the cultural experience. Nationality, too, can be thought of as performed. And one of the things I want to talk about with all three of these concepts today is their usefulness to think about nationality as well as gender and sexuality, to kind of apply queer theory to our understanding of the nation and of nationality. This is maybe a little bit less intuitive. The idea of gender as performed is kind of has bled out into our culture in all sorts of ways. Everything from like a RuPaul's Drag Race kind of show to across many fields in academic culture. But we don't often talk about nations as being something that have an identity that's performed. The closest thing to it maybe in a common teaching is the idea of imagined communities for Benedict Anderson's work, the idea that the nations didn't really exist as an identity that people held in common until there was the mass media, so that people in very far-flung different parts of the same nation could see each other as being in the same group. Before there was the mass media to connect them, and these days social media, which connects people even further away, they might have thought of themselves as being more a part of a local community and not as much a part of a nation. This goes a bit beyond that, though, to say that every aspect of our nationality can be seen as performative, as something that we are, again, putting on as a costume, or comporting ourselves in certain ways in order to communicate information about ourselves to other people within a context. This, too, can be a powerful tool for the ethnographic observation that we want students to be doing, whether those are international students coming into the US or domestic students heading out for study away, or for that matter, international students heading out for third country study away. If we can help students to think about how nationality is performed, and again, have them kind of watching the different ways in which people use their identity performance to communicate information, then we can get them a long way in these ethnographic observation exercises that we would like them to be doing. Another potential usefulness of this is to think about culture shock and re-entry shock as a moment in which we're frustrated in our performance. It's really hard when you're first kind of immersed in a new situation, a new context, to know what to do with yourself. I mean, everything from how to sit to what the correct thing to say could be. And that's one kind of very powerful way to think about culture shock, and also a way that maybe can give people some hope of a strategy to watch and be observers of the ways that people use identity in a culture that they're visiting, in order to think about how they might use some of those strategies in their own performance of their identity, somewhere sort of between what they're used to and what they're now experiencing in their host culture. And the same for reentry shock. A lot of, for example, students who study away in cultures that are, for example, quite a bit slower in pace of life, and perhaps less dramatic users of natural resources or of energy than we are here in the US, less consumeristic, might come back to the US and feel really out of sorts with their home culture. And that in some ways is even worse than culture shock, because that's finding your original home culture to be not as much a home as it used to be. And again, if we can help them think through in terms of how is identity performed and what does that mean? And can you retain some of these ways of performing your identity that are newly acquired, like perhaps using a lot less energy or not consuming as much, but still find your comfort with other ways to reintegrate yourself here in the home culture? Perhaps another implication of this idea of nationality as performed is the notion of how we use the nations generally in our work as intercultural educators. We perhaps over-rely on the concept, and it's not without its importance, of course, because again, nations, like all identities, are very real, and they have legal consequences, right? People have passports and citizenships, and there are rules about where you can go and can't go and for how long, and all of those things matter very much in our work. But we do tend to talk about the movement of people as from one nation to another in a rather monolithic kind of way, and lose sight of the intricacies of identity in that process. Similarly, the way that we sell intercultural experiences, particularly to our outgoing study away students, we tend to market our study away experiences through nations. Lots of offices have other ways now too for people to look for program options, often by academic fields of study, for example, or by particular models, internships versus classroom study, that sort of thing. But often one of the main search functions, and often at the top, is to look by a country in which you want to study. And that perhaps does a disservice, as if all programs in Germany are the same, or as if students might not have very different kinds of reasons for coming into the situation of wanting intercultural exchange other than the nations. The graphic you see here, by the way, is from the national costume section of the Miss Universe pageant, and probably tells us quite a lot about nationality as performed in ways that are verifying what I'm saying, but also showing some of the problems as well. Second here for another poll. Okay, so I think we've got most of our answers there. That's a more dramatically skewed result than I might have expected, but either I'm overly convincing in this, or we're all on the same page with this topic, which is great. So, queering as a verb. Queering as a verb is starts really in its history as a way to think about bringing queer perspectives into all discussions of sexuality and of gender, but has now moved quite a bit beyond that. It's not just about sexual identity anymore. It's about scrutinizing categories, thinking about why they exist, what they're doing, what the work of the category systems is, and in particular the politics around them. And I don't here mean politics in the sense of elections and political parties and systems. I mean it in the much broader sense of everyday politics, who benefits and who loses from systems of categorization. So, for example, a queer theory approach to study of socioeconomic class might include some discussion of the class categories, if it's about U.S. culture, about working class as opposed to middle class, as opposed to upper class, and why middle class is such a predominant category in the U.S. Why it's often the only one that's mentioned in the political arena, as if the others don't actually exist, and middle class really is everyone, which is a very interesting anthropological study on America. It's imported too, this approach, into lots of other kinds of work, and it's been imported for example, into lots of historical work, looking back at other periods of time and trying to queer perspectives on identities in that period. And on the one hand, there's been some significant criticism of the anachronism of that. You're going to take a queer perspective and think about men and women in 13th century France, for example. Although the criticism gets at exactly what the idea of queering is trying to do in the first place, which is to be more critical about those categories. So a queer approach to looking at men and women in the 13th century in France would probably first point out that what we mean by a man or a woman in 13th century France is probably a lot different from what we mean about that today. And therefore, the perspective in some ways might be actually more historically accurate if we can bring that critical stance to the historical studies. When it comes to queering gender, one of the main applications to think about is recognizing that our terms for gender and for sexual identities are just incommensurable. There is really no way to translate these words from one language to another. We in the spirit of translation and the way that translation from one language to another always works, we use the terms we have in our own language of English. But this becomes very problematic very quickly, and I'm going to use a rather dramatic example here to make the case. And that's in the photo here, we have some folks from a group called Hijras, which is an identity category in parts of India and Bangladesh. And this photo is from Bangladesh. And these are folks that, and listen to how I have to describe this because I'm speaking to you in English. These are mostly people, the majority of them are people we would identify as biological males. So already I'm importing some judgments, and things are happening in our heads as I'm saying that. And they are largely dressing in ways that we would see as the female attire of the culture in which they live. And they have a very interesting social status that much of the traditional work of this social category is to play roles in various kinds of ceremonies, whether it has to do with naming of newborn infants in certain specific locations, or participating in weddings or funerals or things of that nature. But of course, that's not the kind of work that necessarily pays you every day of the year, and it's maybe not sustainable. And so a large number of people in the category of hijras also participate in sex work of various kinds, and most of the sex work involves working for men, people we would identify as other biological males. But of course, from the perspective of the culture we're talking about, this isn't, men in drag. This is a system in which there are three genders. So we can't even really talk about male and female, our terms, because it imports the binary that we rely on immediately into our heads and makes it impossible for us to think about what it would really mean. It's a little bit hard when you really try to wrap your head around what does it mean to have a three-gender system if you're from a two-gender system, what that actually would mean. I was talking to a colleague this morning from University of Aberdeen, who's a historian who taught a course on gender and history recently, and he was telling me about giving a lecture on third gender categories around the world, different historical context, and having in the room a student from Oman, a female student from Oman, wearing her hijab, sitting in this group of about 12 students in the seminar. So he gave about a 25-minute lecture, then he turned to discussion, and the students, many of the students who were either from Scotland or other visiting international students said, what are we talking about here? I mean, can you explain better what this is? And they wanted an explanation like the one I gave. Well, this is men dressed in women's clothes, blah, 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 using our own terms. And the student from Oman said, well, what do you mean? What does this mean? Of course there are three genders. Everyone knows that there are three genders because in Oman, in Omani culture, there's a less legally recognized than the hijras of Southeast Asia, but a category Zanith that's a cultural category that has some similarities, even though also some differences from the hijra category. And as they dug into that a little bit, the other students with her in the discussion, and she explained that Zaniths often work as sex workers for men. The student said, so didn't you tell us last week that, your culture looks down upon, homosexuality, on same-sex, sexuality and love, and that's, against, sort of religious precepts of your culture? And she said, but it isn't same-sex. There's never two men in these scenarios. There's a man and a Zanith. And so everybody's minds were sort of blown, which is the point of this problem. These identity categories really are incommensurable from one place to another. And if we can keep that in mind, we can be a lot more critical in our understanding of gender and do our students a lot of service in helping to understand the diversity of gender and sexuality around the world, whether within one culture or between different cultures. We can do the same thing with nationalities. We can unpack them in similar ways to what we would do with gender and sexual identities and think about whether, for example, being someone who identifies as an American national means the same kind of thing in terms of identity as being someone who identifies as a Russian national. Of course, the word is the same, but again, that word is in English in both times that I used it in that sentence. And we're importing our own kind of pre-existing way of thinking about that term and what its work is onto those two different situations. This can have implications for things like what happens to international students, frequently pigeonholing of international students, in very well-intended kinds of ways. We want to involve international students and bring them into discussion and get their perspectives out there in classrooms and extracurriculars and so on. And so we might ask them to talk about, well, as someone from Vietnam, how do you look at this issue? The people in the photo here are from Vietnam. They are Vietnamese nationals. That's the passport they would carry. But in terms of their ethnic identity, they're Hmong. These are Hmong people. And if we have a student coming in from Vietnam who's from a Hmong community, and we ask them to represent Vietnamese culture, we're putting them into a very strange situation. I mean, even a student who's ethnically Vietnamese, we would be asking them to speak for their entire culture and tokenizing them in that way, which is also undesirable. But for someone who doesn't identify with the majoritarian culture of the nationality, then we're making an even bigger mistake. So if we can help, again, study away students also queer their notions of nationality as they're heading out, get them primed and ready to see nationality as complicated as soon as they land on the ground in a particular location, and not to expect, sort of the quaint view of nations that they might have in their heads. That would be really great. And a great service for them. So last concept of the three, and then I'll get to some Q&A here. Disidentification. So here is a concept that explains really nicely how identity really works when people are living in a context in which they're part of a minority, and there's a majoritarian culture that has a kind of dominant effect over their lives. Disidentification describes a process of both identifying with the norms and against them at the same time, using them in kind of a dissonant way that they're not intended to be used. So taking those majority identities and breaking them down into parts and components, and then kind of reshuffling, recycling, and maybe putting some new things in there too to come up with a new identity space. The classic example of this from the literature is the physique pictorials, like the photo here, from the 50s, 60s, the middle of the 20th century, which on their face and at the beginning kind of started off as a way for cisgendered heterosexual men who were, into physical fitness, into athletics, kind of rugged outdoorsman types and athletic types to celebrate, masculinity and a kind of macho sense of masculinity. But they were, as you can imagine, and as you may already know, rapidly reinterpreted and reused by gay men, and became part of a shift in which gay and later queer identified men in the US have reclaimed and recycled parts of this idea of ultra masculine identity in a way that's probably distressing for some of the cisgendered heterosexual men who would identify with these original identity categories. This can be a form of resistance in a situation in which people feel relatively disempowered, and this, for this reason, can be a very useful concept for the work that we do. So just to think about briefly some of its applications in our work, it can be an analytical tool, disidentification, for understanding how minority cultures of all types are eking out space for their identities in a context in which that culture is not the majoritarian culture. By the way, when I'm saying majority and minority here, I'm not meaning population sizes, I'm meaning relative power over the cultural terrain in a particular location. So the majority culture could actually be a small number of people in some cases. For example, New Mexico, great example of a place in which European American culture is dominant, but the majority of people are actually Latino. Disidentification happens too within our programs, and this is a really maybe interesting twist on how to think about this concept. But when we put together a program and bring students into it, we try to kind of create its culture through the way we structure the program. So for example, when we're running a faculty-led study away program, we're wanting to do things these days, and there's really good reason for this, really good theory that supports this, but to try to have an intercultural culture within the program, to get the students engaged in deeply immersing themselves in the host culture and having that be a part of the experience that's very rewarding and educational for them. But of course, students will, as all human beings will, take what you give them, and when they're in a position where they're not the one in power making the decisions, use what they like and maybe use it a little bit differently from what we had intended in some situations. We find ourselves sometimes at odds with the students and try to kind of correct course over and over with them and get them to do something that maybe they don't want to do, or that doesn't really sit well with how they're identifying in the situation of being someone visiting in an intercultural context. And that's maybe a more generous way to think about what's happening in that situation and how to work with it rather than against it. And then, of course, disidentification could also be an interesting way to think about a strategy for folks who find themselves sort of permanently interculturally homeless, either because they've grown up with a bicultural or multicultural upbringing, they haven't lived all of their lives in one place or in one cultural context, or because they've moved around so much in their adult lives and lived in different contexts that now nowhere really quite feels like home. So this identification could be a strategy to take apart the different identities that are presented to you as possible, pulling out, again, the pieces that work for you and putting them back together in a different way that gives you the space to embrace all the aspects of your identity at the same time. The ones you've borrowed from another culture, as well as the ones from the culture in which you find yourself living at the moment. The photo here, the little girl is holding the US flag and Guatemalan flag, and I thought was perhaps a cute and simplistic way to think about this, but helpful nevertheless. So now the last of our polls quickly here. Just wondering, of the three concepts I've briefly addressed today, which you find might be most useful in your work? Okay, wow, so a pretty even distribution, which is quite an interesting result. So just to summarize again some of the practical suggestions that emerged in this, and then I'll begin to address some of the questions that you have as well. When we're conducting orientations for students or pre-departure prep or doing our what we call intercultural interventions, those moments during a program where you engage students in talking about the cross-cultural experience, we can continually re-emphasize that identity is performative and use that as a tool for being more critical about how identity functions and getting away from the stereotypes and assumptions that we come into those discussions with. Similarly, the notions that we talked about, the three, performativity, queering, and disidentification, can help us decenter kind of an easy retreat to the idea of culture as the explaining force here. Some of you, if you've taught any sort of social science courses or even the theoretically laden humanities courses, as I have, you get these essays from students that say things like, you know, society sees women as this and men as this, and you're so frustrated with the reification of society there, and you want them to push it a little further and, you know, really get at what they're actually saying. What is that hiding behind that, you know, that very empty concept of society? But in some of the same ways we use culture in a very empty way in our work, and I'm challenging us to maybe get beyond that a little bit. Thinking beyond nations at a more specific and targeted level here, and the ways that we use national identity when we promote study away and other intercultural opportunities. For example, we could promote opportunities using locations, using particularities of the academic content, and other aspects of the programs that are also important and in some ways tell us more about the program than the nation in which it's based. And then finally, finding ways to work with instead of against our students' their real identity formation processes, especially when we're talking about them disidentifying with the culture that we're trying to create in our programs. So on that note, I'll end there and take some questions. You can type your questions directly into the chat window, and I'm scrolling here to see if I've missed any. I'm also going to move into play here a resources pod with 3 suggestions. Oops, I made that a bit too big and now we can't see. Well, hopefully you can see the 3 things listed there. Yeah, I mean, a great point here from Julian about how disidentification is profoundly ambiguous because it's about always kind of being in tension with different identities, both with and against the majoritarian context. It is profoundly ambiguous, and that's in our work we often try to teach people to be able to sit with ambiguity and to kind of develop a comfort level with ambiguity. And queer theory calls us to that task as well. The second resource listed in the bullet points is one of the go-to works on disidentification by Jose Esteban Munoz, which is about queers of color and looking at the very precarious situation of in the U.S. of the combination of queer identity and person of color identity and cross-cutting tensions between sexual, gender, and racial and ethnic identities, and the need then to kind of eke out a space by, again, choosing bits and pieces and reformulating them away from what the mainstream culture had intended them to be. The first link is the first bullet point is a link to a video with Judith Butler speaking for about 6 minutes and a really nice, quick, kind of a little bit breezy and less horrible than reading her books treatment of how gender is performative can be thought of. Great question from Minnesota Morris here too about whether there are models out there for thinking beyond the nation and study away work. I don't have a ready list of that. Something that I'm trying to work on a little bit on my own campus, but this that particular idea is a newer one in my own work. So I haven't yet come across a lot of folks who are working on that. Then the third resource listed over here is a 20 must-read queer theory texts website. It's got little annotations of each text. It's a it's a blog post and it's got a particular kind of bias to it, but it's still a useful listing of 20 texts that are good ones to start with. Some of them are simply an online article, and some of them are book length, either monographs or anthologies. And it is if you're new to queer theory and you want to kind of dive into it a little bit and do some reading, this list would give you a couple good places to start. Okay, now the questions are really coming in. Oh, thanks whoever's helping caption them. Yeah, so Tommy's question here is about how a lot of this material might be useful as a resource for represented groups to recognize that they marginalize the underrepresented. So what are practical ways to kind of approach that in students, volunteers, et cetera, that are feeling marginalized in a new cultural context? I think the same principles apply, actually, even though my examples weren't of that kind. Whether we're talking about either our outgoing group being the majoritarian group or arriving with some sort of privilege and needing to kind of check that privilege and be conscientious about the ways in which their presence might affect the folks among whom they're volunteering or among whom they're studying and living, or we're talking about them finding themselves feeling like the minority in a rather extreme way because they've landed in a new culture, using the sense of identity as performative, queering some of the boundaries and categorical identity formation categories that are in play, and even disidentification can all be useful categories for both of those scenarios. There's a question about whether the links suggested are in the field of education, and no, they're not. Actually, they're broader than that. They're queer theory resources in general. There are some really great writings about queer theory in K-12 education primarily, and a little bit about queer pedagogies in university classrooms as well. Um, I think it's still a relatively new discussion in intercultural education specifically, and one that I hope to continue to be a part of with some of the others presenting these webinars and um, other folks who are interested along the way. Yeah, great question from KSU about how pre-departure orientations are so packed with the nuts and bolts, telling students, when to arrive and about their visa and, all those sorts of nutsy boltsy things you have to cover. That getting into a topic this kind of rigorous and theoretical is hard to even imagine with the time that's available, and that's a very real problem. Um, some of the ways to work around that might include, if there's the staff bandwidth for this, offering something optional that the students don't have to attend, but those who are thinking about this topic could attend, or building it into, if you use an online system like the Teradata system, you could build out learning content, which wouldn't have to be updated as quite as frequently or as in as much attentive detail as things like when to arrive, which of course changes every single time students leave the office. That would give students something at least to read to start with. It's also something that we could perhaps include for faculty leaders of faculty-led programs in their training, in addition to thinking about intercultural interactions and immersion in general, giving them some of these tools from something like queer theory as another way, another inroad into the kind of learning we hope that students will have in their programs. And some of the folks are commenting that one strategy is to include the nutsy boltsy things in the online orientation, leaving students to do that stuff on their own, and then using the in-person orientation for exactly this type of thing. And that is something that we have also headed towards at Gustavus Adolphus College as well. The orientation coordinator, Brian Messerly, has just designed an entirely new one that we're launching this year for the outgoing summer and fall students. Yeah, here I see Nick's comment too about maybe it would be good if we had a kind of national or collective online pre-departure orientation module somewhere covering LGBTQ plus topics, giving students at least the general sense of this theory and how these things work in terms of identity formation as they head out into their programs. That's not a bad idea. I think the closest thing I've known of to that is the Rainbow SIGs list of resources, but that's not really topical so much as it is a kind of unannotated bibliography of things they could link to and read on their own, and not parsed for them in any way. So that would be a good project to develop. So it seems like we've come to a point where the chat is still running, but it's a lot of talking amongst ourselves, and I'm wondering if one of the organizers wants to step back in.
Certainly, Roger. Everyone, thank you so much for the great commentary. Roger, thank you for a fantastic presentation. It looks like you've definitely generated a great brainstorm. But we'll conclude the webinar at this point. Thank you everyone for attending. Stay tuned next Thursday for 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Ally Training for Study Abroad Advisors, presented by Scott Taylor and Chris Holloway from CIS Abroad. Again, this session has been recorded and will be posted to the Summer of the Rainbow website, so you can access it for further reference and to share with your colleagues. Again, Roger, our many thanks. I think this was really a very inspiring, informative presentation, and we definitely appreciate your participation.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for attending as well.